I still remember the look on her face, calm, confused, maybe a little amused, when two cops drew their weapons on her in our front yard. My wife was literally tying her shoelace for her morning jog, wearing jogglers, a hoodie, and yes, a legally holstered sidearm. The officers, tense. One called for backup, the other radioed in. Female suspect, armed, possibly unstable, neighborhood complaint. But in less than 10 seconds, everything flipped. Because the armed woman they were about to confront was the new chief of police. My wife, Sarah Bennett, and the person who made that panicked 911 call wasn't afraid. She was playing a game. Her name was Karen Franklin, HOA president and self-declared queen of the cul-de-sac. And that phone call? It wasn't about safety. It was about control. And that morning, standing on our lawn with her lapdog and smug little smirk, she thought she was about to take my wife down with a false police report. But what she didn't know was that she'd just declared war on the wrong woman. This isn't just a story about HOA abuse. This is about what happens when unchecked power meets the one thing it can't control: truth, law, and a woman who doesn't back down. So grab your coffee or your wine and let me take you into the wildest neighborhood drama you've ever heard. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment if you've ever had a Karen in your HOA, and subscribe for more real stories that sound too crazy to be fiction. Now let me tell you what really happened. And it all started with a shoelace, a gun, and a very, very bad call. It was supposed to be a regular Tuesday. The kind where my wife, Sarah, laces up her sneakers, tugs on that old college hoodie she refuses to throw away, and takes her morning jog around the block before the rest of the neighborhood finishes their first cup of coffee. But that morning, things took a turn. I was pouring coffee when I heard it, shouting. I stepped out onto the porch and froze. 2 squad cars, lights flashing, officers standing on our lawn with their hands near their holsters. And my wife, cool as a cucumber, standing there with one sneaker untied and a legally holstered firearm on her hip. Yeah, you heard that right. Sarah wasn't breaking the law. She was off-duty, licensed to carry, and wearing her sidearm the same way she always did on her jogs. Like half the other cops in our county. But the moment one of the officers spoke into his radio and said, "Suspect is armed, female, possibly unstable, neighborhood complaint," my stomach dropped. I knew exactly who made that call. Karen Franklin, HOA president, professional pearl clutcher, and apparently now self-appointed 911 strategists. I glanced across the street and sure enough, there she was. Karen, cradling her miniature poodle like a baby and whispering into her phone like she was reporting a terrorist. She even gave the officers a little wave. Just in case they missed her Oscar-worthy performance. "Sarah?" She simply stood up slowly, showed her hands and said, calm as can be, "Officers, I recommend you look at my waistband." That's when everything shifted. Their eyes scanned the badge clipped next to her hip. One of them went pale. The other nearly dropped his radio. Chief Bennett?" the younger one stammered. Chief, dispatch didn't tell us it was you." Sarah gave them a half smile, not angry, not smug. "You're disappointed. You were doing your job, now I need to do mine." And with that she turned, not toward the house, toward Karen. Now look, Karen's not stupid. Manipulative? Yes. Delusional? Definitely. But stupid? No. So when Sarah walked over, badge visible, calm as ever, Karen's face went from triumphant to terrified real fast. Sarah said, "Karen, filing a false police report about an armed threat is a felony. You endangered me, you endangered my neighbors, and you put those officers in a terrible position." Karen blinked, then said, "Well, how was I supposed to know you were you?" Sarah paused. "That's exactly why you don't call the cops on people without knowing the facts. Karen sputtered something about feeling unsafe and doing what was right. But the damage was done. That afternoon, 6 neighbors showed up at our door. One brought brownies, another brought pie. Someone even brought a 6-pack and said, "Chief, that woman's lost her mind. What can we do to help?" It was the first time in months I'd seen our street united. Turns out when fear tactics backfire, people start waking up. And Karen? Well, she wasn't done. Because the next day, she wrote a neighborhood newsletter, accusing my wife, the police chief, of threatening her with a weapon. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. But hey, what's an HOA war without a little propaganda, right? Coming up next, how one newsletter almost got our neighborhood sued, and why my wife didn't say a word but turned the tables anyway. If you've ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, you've probably met someone like Karen Franklin. Scratch that. You've probably tried to avoid her. In our town, she wasn't just a Karen. She was the Karen, the term HOA president, self-declared guardian of property values, queen of the cul-de-sac with a clipboard. But don't let the yoga pants and tiny dog fool you. Karen ran our HOA like a Cold War regime. She didn't just enforce rules, she invented them. Holiday lights still up on January 2nd? That's a fine. Grass half an inch over the limit? Double fine. Kids' sidewalk chalk drawings of cats and rainbows? Criminal vandalism, apparently. And God forbid you leave your trash bins out past 10 o'clock on pickup day. You'd get a warning slip in Comic Sans font with 6 exclamation points and the phrase "community standards violation." Yes, she really bolded that part. At first, people put up with her. She had that fake nice charm, talked about unity and safety while casually mentioning who hadn't paid dues or whose mailbox looked a little too rustic. But the power, it got to her. You could see it in the way she walked, chest out, whistle around her neck like she was coaching a suburban football team nobody asked for. She didn't just attend HOA meetings, she dominated them. She once silenced a complaint by literally ringing a hotel bell on the table and shouting, "Order." We all thought she'd eventually calm down. She didn't. In fact, she escalated. Her latest crusade? Banning visible firearms in the neighborhood, even though we live in a state where open carry is perfectly legal. But this wasn't about guns. It was about control, about sending a message. I decide what's safe around here. That's when she picked her fight with Sarah. Now, some folks might back down when a power-hungry HOA president comes knocking. Sarah, not so much. When Karen stormed into our yard 2 days before the 911 incident, waving a homemade citation and yelling about creating a dangerous atmosphere, Sarah didn't even stand up. She calmly wiped her hands on a towel and said, "Karen, you're trespassing. And also, that's not a real citation." Karen, flustered but undeterred, snapped, "I expected better from someone in your position. You're setting a terrible example." Sarah smiled. That kind of slow, even smile that says, "You've just made a mistake, but I'm going to let you walk out of this with your dignity if you stop talking right now." And then she said, "I am setting an example, one that follows the law, not whatever rule book you wrote in your sleep." Karen left in a huff. And that's when she called the police. What she didn't count on? That the woman she tried to frame was the chief of police. And now the entire neighborhood was starting to see the cracks in her porcelain throne. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. The next day, she wrote that newsletter I mentioned earlier. You know, the one where she accused Sarah of creating division and brandishing a weapon with intent to intimidate? It was full color, double-sided, glossy. She even used HOA funds to print it. She didn't just drop it in mailboxes, she taped it to front doors like some suburban scarlet letter. And she signed it, "In service to safety, Karen Franklin, HOA president." The backlash was immediate. One neighbor came by and said, "Is this woman serious?" Another held up the newsletter and said, "This feels like propaganda from a spy movie." But Sarah? She didn't respond on Facebook, didn't make a speech, didn't even tweet. She made one call to the city attorney's office. It was the beginning of Karen's unraveling. Coming up next, how one neighborhood newsletter triggered a citywide investigation, and how Karen's paranoia dug a hole she couldn't climb out of. Karen's glossy newsletter had just made its grand debut, fluttering across the neighborhood like a bad perfume sample nobody asked for. It read like a dystopian bedtime story. A woman with a weapon, intimidating neighbors, refusing to cooperate with HOA standards. The woman in question? My wife, Chief Sarah Bennett. The same woman who taught CPR at the community center and rescued a cat from a sewer last Christmas. I read the whole thing twice, partly out of disbelief, mostly because the fonts changed mid-sentence, like she'd written it in a rage spiral. Sarah, on the other hand, she didn't flinch. She just calmly pulled out her phone and said, "Well, that's going straight to the city attorney." I half joked, "You gonna frame it first?" She didn't even smile. That's when I knew. Karen had crossed the final line. The line between being a pain in the HOA and being a legal liability. The city council scheduled a closed-door meeting with Sarah within days. Apparently Karen's little HOA tantrum had made it all the way downtown, but Sarah showed up with a copy of the 911 transcript. Her body cam footage. Yes, she wears one off duty. She's that prepared. And a manila folder labeled HOA harassment, Exhibit A through Q. She didn't go in there to argue. She went in to educate. When she played the 911 audio, Karen's voice shrill, calling Sarah a suspicious armed woman threatening the peace. You could hear the oxygen leave the room. One council member even muttered, "She called the cops on the cop." Sarah nodded, and she knew who I was when she made the call. She laid it all out. The illegal fines, the intimidation, the unapproved bylaws, even the anonymous flyers warning residents not to associate with certain individuals. Spoiler, those individuals were anyone who disagreed with Karen. By the end, they didn't ask questions. They just said, "We'll be in touch." Meanwhile, Karen doubled down like it was Vegas. She called an emergency HOA meeting at the community center, this time with snacks. Nothing says "I'm innocent" like cookies from Costco. She stood at the front like a discount politician, waving a clipboard and preaching about restoring neighborhood safety. Then she pointed right at Sarah, who was sitting in the back row, quietly sipping from her reusable water bottle, and said, "Some people in positions of power are using fear to silence this community." You could hear 3 people cough uncomfortably. One guy whispered, "Isn't she the chief of police?" Then it happened. Greg, the quiet neighbor, the one who trims his hedges with a ruler, stood up and said, "Karen, you called the cops on our neighbor for wearing a holstered firearm in an open carry state, and she's literally the police chief." Karen, flustered, tried to pivot. Well, how was I supposed to know who she was? She wasn't in uniform. Sarah stood up slowly, calm. "So your excuse is that I look too normal?" Dead silence. Yours. Sweet 70-something, bakes lemon bars that could end wars. Clapped. Ben said, "That's enough, Karen, we're tired." What followed was the most polite revolution I've ever witnessed. People began standing, speaking, not yelling, just calmly dismantling Karen's throne, brick by passive-aggressive brick. The HOA's vice president? He resigned on the spot, said he couldn't ethically support the current direction. Karen? She turned red, then purple, then somewhere in between. She grabbed her purse, muttered something about lawyers, and stormed out like a sitcom villain who just found out she wasn't invited to the block party. But this wasn't over. Because while the community was reclaiming its voice, Karen was backstage, prepping her next move. Coming up next, the lawsuit, the headlines, and the absolutely unhinged conspiracy flyers that made their way under every door on the block. If you had told me 3 weeks earlier that our cookie-cutter suburb would rise up like some modern-day revolution over a false 911 call, I would have laughed. But then the doorbell rang. And again. And again. One by one, neighbors started showing up, not with torches and pitchforks, but with brownies, handwritten notes, and a cooler full of off-brand soda. The first guy, Ron, the math teacher with socks and sandals energy, stood on our porch and said, "We saw everything. That woman's nuts. What can we do to help?" Behind him, Mrs. Patel had a tray of samosas. Behind her, Greg, yes, Hedge Symmetry Greg, had printed out a petition titled, "Restore Sanity to the HOA." Something had shifted. For years, people tiptoed around Karen like she had access to some dark HOA spell book. But now they were done being afraid of late fees and vague threats about mailbox alignment violations. Sarah didn't say much. She just offered everyone lemonade and listened. She was always like that. Never the loudest. Never the flashiest. But when people needed someone to believe in, she showed up. Later that night, the neighborhood forum, which, let's be honest, usually hosted passive-aggressive posts about trash bins, lit up like Times Square. There were threads titled, "Karen called the cops on a hero," "Via our HOA needs an overhaul and a chill pill," and my personal favorite, "Megaphones don't make you right." People began sharing their own Karen stories, like how she once fined a veteran for hanging an American flag a day early before Memorial Day. Others admitted they'd been too scared to speak up, worried they'd be targeted like Sarah. But now that Sarah had stood her ground, with evidence, calm, and a badge, they weren't scared anymore. Even Tom, the guy who'd abstained during the no-confident vote, stopped by with a six-pack and an awkward half-apology. "I think I signed something I didn't understand. Karen said it was for streetlights." It was, not for streetlights. We forgave him, kind of. Then came the bake sale. Yes, a bake sale. Because how else do suburban Americans express political solidarity? The entire block turned out. Kids painted signs that said, "Support your chief" in crayon. Greg grilled hot dogs. Sarah stood in the background, handing out water and answering quiet questions like, "So, what's the legal difference between a fine and harassment?" The air felt different. Lighter. No tension, no fake smiles. Just neighbors becoming a community again. Karen, of course, didn't attend. But she did drive by real slow in her SUV, sunglasses on, tiny dog in her lap, glaring like Darth HOA. Someone waved. She didn't wave back. We didn't care. Because something stronger than fear was growing now. Solidarity. And just when it felt like maybe we'd finally turned a corner, a new round of newsletters dropped. Except these weren't printed on HOA letterhead. They were anonymous, slipped under doors in the dead of night. And hoo boy, they made the last ones look like poetry. We thought the worst was over. Turns out, the real battle was made of paper, toner, and just enough unhinged energy to rival a political smear campaign. It started innocently. One morning, people found folded newsletters in their mailboxes, slipped in quietly, unsigned, but unmistakably Karen-esque. The headline? "Restoring Safety and Decency to Our Streets." And underneath it, a photo of a silhouette woman with a red circle and slash across her holster. Sarah. They didn't use her name, of course. Instead, it said a known law enforcement figure, as if she were some shadowy figure from a thriller novel, not the neighbor who once helped unclog Mrs. Geller's garbage disposal. Inside the newsletter were claims like, "Children no longer feel safe walking to school. Open carry is being used as an intimidation tactic." And my personal favorite, "There are rumors of secret surveillance." Secret surveillance? Sarah was still trying to get our porch camera to sync with the Wi-Fi. But the real kicker? A full-page call to action suggesting that residents report unusual behavior, including tactile gear on jogs, frequent porch activity, excessive eye contact, It was as if George Orwell co-wrote the HOA memo during a fever dream. Some neighbors laughed. Others were confused. A few actually started acting weird. Stiff hellos, quick glances at Sarah's belt. One guy asked if her water bottle counted as gear. She told him only if it was carbonated. We considered ignoring it. But Sarah, being Sarah, filed a formal complaint, this time not just to the HOA, but directly to the city attorney's office. She attached the flyer. She attached the previous false 911 report. And then she did something genius. She attached a body cam clip from the morning Karen called the cops. Clear, calm, timestamp. Sarah had been wearing it out of habit. Now, it became evidence. The city council received a packet 2 inches thick. Within days, they issued a statement condemning misuse of HOA communication channels for defamatory and fear-mongering content. Boom. But Karen wasn't done. No, the next round of newsletters was glossy, full color, professionally printed. She even tried to distribute them outside the neighborhood, at the farmer's market, the public library, the dentist's office. One of them ended up taped to a post in front of a fire station. Guess who volunteers at that fire station? Yeah, Sarah. The firefighter on duty called her immediately, said, "Hey chief, we've got a flammable pamphlet situation out here." We laughed. But then Sarah's phone buzzed. A local news reporter had seen the flyer and wanted an interview. Sarah wasn't sure. She hated the spotlight. But then she looked at the newsletter again, sighed, and said, "If she's going to make me a villain, let's show people the real story." What came next would put our quiet suburb on the map. Because the paper war was just the beginning. You could feel it in the air. The HOA meeting that night wasn't just tense, it was electric. Not the kind of electricity you get from Christmas lights and block party vibes. No. This was revolution-level voltage. The folding chairs were all filled. Some people brought their own. Someone even brought popcorn. Okay, that was me. I had a feeling. Karen walked in late. Big sunglasses, clipboard. Tiny dog tucked under her arm like a royal accessory. She looked like she was ready to address the UN, not a neighborhood with 3 cul-de-sacs and a community pool. She started talking before she even sat down. There has been a coordinated effort to undermine this board. Certain residents have created chaos and confusion, and I will not. That's when Mrs. Geller stood up. 73 years old. Never missed a meeting in 15 years. Usually just asked about flower beds and potlucks. But that night, she said, "Karen, enough." The room went silent. Even the dog stopped panting. She continued, "I've lived here longer than anyone in this room. I've seen kids grow up, trees grow tall, and yes, HOA presidents come and go. But I've never seen anyone abuse power the way you have." Karen tried to interject. Mrs. Geller, with all due respect. But Greg, the man who once filed a complaint over uneven mulch, cut her off. He held up a printout of the flyer Karen had distributed. "You called the police on the chief of police. You lied. You spread fear. You turned our HOA into your own courtroom where you were judge, jury, and executioner." Then came the motion. It was quiet at first. A simple hand raise from someone in the back. Then another. Then 10. Then 27. The vice president stood. As per HOA bylaws, any member can call for a no-confidence vote if more than 10 residents support the motion. Karen tried to laugh it off. "You think this is going to stop me? This is ridiculous. This is a witch hunt." But nobody was laughing. The vote was held right there. It wasn't even close. 28 votes to remove her, 2 to keep her, 1 abstention. Karen stood frozen, like her brain hadn't caught up to what her ego was refusing to process. She muttered, "I'll sue all of you." Someone whispered, "Get in line." And just like that, the queen of the cul-de-sac was dethroned. The room let out a long, shared breath. Some hugged, some clapped. Sarah? She just quietly nodded and left out the side door. like she always does when her work is done. But we all knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a vote. It was the beginning of taking our neighborhood back. Of course, this wasn't Karen's final act. Oh no, because the next morning, we woke up to a certified letter taped to our door. Sarah was being sued. Personally, for defamation, emotional distress, and wait for it, abuse of authority. Because when you lose the vote, you try the courtroom. You'd think after being voted out and publicly humiliated, most people would take the L and disappear quietly. Not Karen Franklin. She didn't just double down, she built a whole bunker beneath the battlefield and threw grenades from there. The lawsuit came first. Certified, mail, thick packet. Karen was suing Sarah personally for defamation, emotional distress, and, get this, abuse of authority as a public official. I remember Sarah opening the envelope at the kitchen table, sighing once, and saying, "She's really trying it." No panic, no drama. Just that low, exhausted chuckle you make when your dog drags in the third dead squirrel that week. Luckily, Sarah's brother Evan is a civil attorney and a shark. He read the complaint and said it looked like it was written by someone who Googled how to sue someone for hurting my feelings at 2 a.m. But Karen wasn't done. That same week, neighbors found anonymous flyers under their doors, lurid headlines, weird fake quotes, even a watch list of residents allegedly too close to law enforcement. Sarah made the list. So did Greg. So did Mrs. Geller. Congratulations. We'd officially made the HOA blacklist. And then came the drones. Yes, drones. A neighbor spotted a buzzing quadcopter hovering over Sarah's yard one afternoon while she was unloading groceries. It had a tiny sticker on the side, Neighborhood Safety Patrol. Yeah, that wasn't creepy at all. Sarah didn't say anything publicly. She just logged everything. Photos, videos, drone serial number. The receipts were stacking up like a Costco return line after Christmas. Then came the final blow. A tip was sent anonymously to the city. Inside, photoshopped images of Sarah doing everything from vandalizing buildings to sneaking into bars in uniform. One was so bad it looked like it was pulled from a 2003 video game. Sarah traced the metadata. Yep, from Karen's old laptop. The one she turned in after being voted out. Turns out she handed over a decoy. The real one? Found in her storage unit, which, thanks to a subpoena from the city's legal team, they got access to. And that's when things went full Netflix docuseries. Inside the unit, HOA files stacked floor to ceiling. Surveillance drones unopened. Printed spreadsheets labeled priority control targets. We were numbers 3, 4, and 7. Fake fines. Fake mailers. And a whole section labeled emerging threats with the names of teenage skateboarders. It was like Orwell meets Pinterest in there. Sarah stayed calm through it all. She didn't rant. She didn't threaten. She just handed everything to the city attorney, who smiled like it was Christmas morning. The defamation suit? Dismissed. Karen's Neighborhood Safety Initiative? Labeled a fraudulent shell. Her HOA funds? Unaccounted for. Over $75,000, 0 cents gone. Suddenly, this wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was a federal case in the making. And Sarah? She was quietly putting the final piece in place. A blueprint to prevent this from ever happening again, not just here, but in neighborhoods across the country. Because the storm wasn't over. But the rebuild? That was about to begin. The drones were gone. The flyers had stopped. The lawsuit was dismissed. And Karen? Karen had vanished like a badly written season finale character. Except this show wasn't over. It was just entering its healing arc. After months of chaos, something wild happened in our neighborhood. Peace. Not boring peace, but the kind where neighbors smiled at each other without flinching, where kids chalked hopscotch patterns without being fined, where folks watered their lawns because they wanted to, not because they feared a pink slip on their mailbox. And Sarah? She didn't walk around like a hero. No badge thumping, no speeches, no "I told you so." She still jogged every morning, same pace, same quiet smile, same legally holstered sidearm. Except now, instead of suspicious glances, she got waves, some claps. One guy saluted her with his coffee. The HOA? Rebuilt from the inside out. The little office Karen used as her throne of terror? It's now a community resource room, with legal guides, mental health flyers, and free lemonade on Saturday. The priority control targets list? Shredded and burned, literally, at a neighborhood bonfire. Sarah didn't attend, but she smiled when someone dropped off a toasted marshmallow with 7 written on the napkin. The best part? It wasn't about revenge. It was about reform. The city council rolled out new laws inspired by Sarah's case, requiring HOA financial transparency, banning solo enforcement authority, and protecting residents from targeted harassment. And when they offered Sarah an official award, she politely declined and said, "This was never about me. It was about what happens when no one holds power accountable." She didn't want to be the face of justice. But she became the reason this place feels like home again. One moment stood out most. A quiet teenager walked up to her during the clubhouse reopening. Awkward, fidgety, clearly nervous. He handed her a hand-drawn comic. In it, she was a superhero. Not flying, not shooting lasers, just standing between a frightened neighbor and a shadowy figure labeled fear. On the last page, the boy had written, "Thanks for showing us you don't have to be loud to be powerful." Sarah read it, smiled, and said, "That's the kind of badge I'll always wear." Today, our neighborhood isn't perfect, but it's free. Free from fear, free from petty fines, free to be us. And it's all because one woman stood her ground, not with anger, not with threats, but with patience, calm, and unwavering integrity. So if you've ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they were royalty, or a neighbor who mistook paranoia for policy, remember this: rules can be rewritten, power can be checked, and sometimes all it takes is one steady jogger with a badge and a backbone. If this story made you feel something, hit that like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that prove everyday courage can reshape entire communities. Because sometimes the quietest voice in the room turns out to be the one that rewrites the rules for everyone.